Beltz of James Bell Associates. This is the second of two webinars that we presented this month on the use of administrative data in the evaluation of child welfare programs. Today's presentation is Propensity Score Matching, a quasi-experimental alternative to random assignment. Some housekeeping first. We're going to keep the phone lines muted during the presentation. They're muted now, but we'd love to hear from you if you have questions as we go along. To submit a question, please type it in the text box. If you look at your WebEx Event Center on the upper right, there's a chat icon. If you click that, it'll pop up the chat box on the lower right of your screen. You can just type in any questions you have. And if you would, try and remember to send it to the presenter. You'll see a list of people that you can send the question to. But if you send it to presenter, we'll get it most quickly, and Andy will be able to answer your question very quickly after you've asked it. But as the questions come through, I am going to keep an eye on that box, and I'll bring the questions up, and we will work them in as soon as possible when they come through. We're going to have a recorded version of this webinar, and it'll be available on the James Bell Associates website shortly. So I want to go ahead and introduce our speaker today, Andy Barclay. Andy, when you have a bunch of people in the room where there's lots of folks who think of themselves as the smartest person in the room, Andy usually really is. Andy's got degrees in mechanical and electrical engineering, and he's worked in computing for over 30 years, both in for-profit and not-for-profit. He has expertise in hardware and software engineering, high-performance computing, visualization, statistics, machine learning, and public health. It was a win in an international software contest that allowed Andy to shift from medical technology research into the child welfare, and he now concentrates on training, research, statistics, evaluation, and policy work in child welfare with his wife, Michelle Barclay. Andy and Michelle also founded and endowed the Barton Child Law and Policy Center at Emory University School of Law to advocate for research-based policy and to encourage students from all disciplines into public interest career paths. Andy also co-founded the Fostering Court Improvement Project to promote the use of outcomes data at the local level in juvenile courts around the country. The way I know Andy is that he contributed expertise as a statistician on the Permanency Innovations Initiative, or PI as we call it. The ACF launched PI in 2010. It was a 6-project demonstration to test strategies to improve permanency outcomes among children in foster care who have the most serious barriers to permanency. So California was one of those 6 sites, and much of what Andy is presenting today is based on work that he did to develop a comparison group for the evaluation of California's PI project. So with that, Andy, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Heidi. When I came on to PI, I really didn't have much idea what I was getting into, and we did have this one grantee where they were not doing a randomized controlled trial, and so I thought, well, okay, but we should be able to do propensity score matching or regression discontinuity or some other non-experimental evaluation. But then as I learned more about it, there were some twists and turns that actually made propensity score matching inappropriate. It would not have worked by itself with this grantee. So I came up with this alternate method, and I'm calling it PSM plus. The plus is for a little bit of, you might call it trickery, to get a comparison group using outcomes that we can predict from the baselines. So that's kind of the setup for everything. I need a few terms in order to talk about this stuff. So I'm going to walk through some of the evaluation terminology, just a few things that I need to set it up. And then I want to get into what the vanilla propensity score matching that has been used for about 25 years, I think. And then I want to talk about the addition that I made to it, but then I really want to get some time to show you some examples of how this worked and how well it worked, because we had some randomized controlled trials to compare to, and I was able to produce exactly the same result as the control group in one of them. So it looks like it does work. We did need some more evaluation. So first off is formative versus summative, because these projects were all in the formative stages, and the way I like to describe it is a formative is as if the chef is tasting the soup and there's too much salt. Well, if there's too much salt, you're in trouble. You got to start over. But if there isn't enough salt, you put a little bit in. So you iterate until you get it right, and before you send it out to the customers. And then in summative is when we're sending it out into the field, and it's got to be implemented right, and customers are going to give us feedback on how well it works. And after working in child welfare for, I guess, about 19 years now, these interventions that we have are deploying at large scales much too early, I think. They need to stay informative, and I understand the challenges of doing that, but we really need to stay where we can control the interventions well and get them, modify the designs and evaluate them quickly with quick turnaround. So something like this, propensity score matching, without having to go through the full randomized controlled trials is what we need, I think, in the formative stages. So that we can do this quick iteration of testing the soup. So we, in the PI project and in a lot of other projects that I've worked on, we have to start from a well-formed research question. And so we've relied on, I think this was developed by medical doctors for diagnosis a long time ago, but they have a four-letter acronym for what makes up a well-formed question, and it's PICO. First, you start with a population. Originally, they started with patient, but we call it population. You have to define your population pretty specifically, as specifically as you can. And then you have an intervention you want to apply, and of course, in the formative stage, that intervention will be modified, but we generally have an intervention that we want to apply. And then we have a comparison group. You have to have a comparison group, and that's most of what I'm going to focus on today. In randomized trials, that comparison group is the non-treated group, the non-intervention group, the group that does not get the treatment, who are randomized to the other arm of the treatment. When we don't have that, we often will use a matched design, and so I'm going to call that comparison group the counterfactual group, but sometimes I'll refer to it as the matched group, and they're all the same thing, comparison, matched, and counterfactual, just different terms for the same thing. And then finally, there's an outcome, and that has to be really well defined, particularly at the beginning of the process. And in this method, it really has to be very specifically defined, because I ended up using a prediction of the outcome in matching the subjects. And that'll make a lot of statisticians very squirmy, as it should. But I think it can be done. I haven't heard an argument against yet, and it appears to work. So here's an example at the bottom of this slide of one of our research questions. Do children in foster care, that's population, achieve more timely and stable permanence, outcome, if their families receive services under the new model, and notice we said families are receiving the services too, new model, that's the intervention, compared to children in foster care whose families, same group, receive usual services, that's the comparison group. As I said, the comparison group will form our counterfactual, and I know it's a very troublesome term. but I kind of like it because of the counterfact part of it. It's what didn't happen, and it's what we don't know when we just plunge forward with an intervention without either a control group or a comparison group. We don't know what would have happened to those children if we hadn't brought the intervention to them. So an example is that the subject received the treatment. That's what actually did happen. But what did not happen was the subject not receiving the treatment, so double negative. And I think that's maybe a useful way to remember what a counterfactual is. It's our comparison group. If we don't, or if when we're selecting a group, if we don't select at random, we're going to have selection bias. We're going to have bias in our sample, and we won't always know what that is, or we'll probably never know what that is, actually, the extent of the bias, the causes of it. And so there are many flavors of this, and it can drastically change your the effect sizes that you'll find when you're trying to evaluate an intervention. So it's very important that we control for it for selection bias, and this matching is the method that we're using since we don't have randomization. So we're always starting from baseline observations. These are the values of the variables that we observe at a baseline, and the definition of baseline may vary with the study. Usually what we want is a point that in time that's closest to the start of the intervention, because we're going to take observations at that point, or we want to get as close to that point as we can get. So we find out everything about the subjects that we can right before the intervention takes place. And so we'll have per subject baseline dates. Each subject has their own baseline date, and the information that we use there can include everything from their past, but nothing ever from the future. So, you know, I know that sounds stupid, but this is a really big problem. So in PI, it was a very big problem. It often is with administrative data sets that are updated, cleaned up, changed over periods of years. We can bring information from the future back into that data set. So here's an example. So we had one grantee where I was evaluating the intervention, and I noticed that all of the intervention subjects were visually or hearing impaired. That was not one of the selection criteria. How did this happen? They were all visually or hearing impaired. Well, it turns out the data system was changed simultaneous with the start of the intervention, and they had miscoded that variable. That's information that it came from the future. They went back and updated it, and it was perfectly selecting the subjects. So because the subjects were selected over a period of time, and this change in the data system corresponded with when they started the subject acquisition. So that had to be taken out because it was very predictive and everything was matched on that. And of course, I couldn't find any comparison subjects because nobody before that had visual or hearing impairment. Okay, so also a lot of the interventions we deal with in child welfare will have a time component to them, and we'll be looking for times to an event. And when you're looking at times to an event, we're looking into the future, and along the way, we may lose track of some of the subjects. And this causes a very important, a very difficult to handle problem, and we term it censoring. When we have subjects that we lose them in the study, we need to know precisely when we lost them. And the reason this is important is that we need to know exactly how much time we had in tracking that subject from their baseline. And when I'm matching an intervention subject to a comparison subject, say, I want subjects with the same follow-up time. That's very important. Otherwise, if I match a subject with, say, a short follow-up time to a subject with a long follow-up time, the subject with the longer follow-up time, we may know an outcome on them that's actually beyond what we would know in the intervention subject. And so I have to cut off the information at the censoring time. Very important. Okay, so getting back to randomized controlled trials, many pros to randomized controlled trials. One, the biggie, that we can actually do causal inference using them. Without randomization isolating that one characteristic of the intervention, we can't say for sure the cause of any effects that we see. We can build up a lot of evidence, and we can use a lot of correlations. We can do our best to take out all of the biases, but with this method, with other non-experimental methods, you're never going to be able to say that your intervention caused this particular effect. But in the formative stages, I think that's this. We want to get as much evidence as we can, but the cost, the time, the loss of statistical power that you might get with a randomized trial aren't worth it in a formative stage where you're iterating on an intervention and trying to make it better. Use that in the summative stage if you can. And of course, there are certain, this is in the cons, there are certain preclusions where you're never going to be able to randomize. One example is a countywide practice change. We can't, that's what happened with this, with the PI study. We didn't have available a comparison group that was cotemporal, that had, that was in the same county at the same time. So we had to use a historical group and match them. And of course, a lot had changed over that time. So other cons to RCT, it can be somewhat inefficient. You have to recruit twice as many subjects because you usually want the same number in your control arm. And so that's going to decrease your statistical power. Things like intent to treat designs, other things can contribute to a loss of statistical power. And by that I mean you may be getting smaller effects from your intervention that you won't be able to actually pick up with a statistical test. It may not show up because you didn't have enough statistical power, which usually translates into sample size. Also, they're fragile. So I guess when I worked in the medical field, I did evaluations on, I don't know, something on the order of 60 new drugs with randomized control trials, and those were tightly controlled, you know, billions of dollars at stake, but there were difficulties, and randomization did break. You know, in child welfare, I think I've only been a part of maybe 6 or 10 randomized trials, but I think every single one of them that I've seen broke in some way that was important. And by broke, I mean the randomization failed, and it wasn't really a failing of the randomization. It's that the subjects weren't actually selected at random in the end. Many times we have problems with crosstalk, meaning a subject that was put into the control arm is perhaps receiving the treatment intervention, or the worker that is treating that non-treatment arm subject brings over some expertise from the intervention. There are a lot of ways in which randomization can fail in the end. Many times you don't know that you're going to get enough subjects. And then finally, there's convenience. RCT can only be applied prospectively. It can't be applied to observational studies, and the methods that I'm talking about can be applied retrospectively. Okay, so getting into the matching. What we're looking for is a matched counterfactual comparison group. So we have our intervention group. They received whatever, in this case, a practice change that was designed over many years and monitored very carefully for fidelity. And then we need a group to compare them to that looks exactly like them, that in every way that's important to both the selection into the study and important to the outcome of interest. That's the part that I think gets left out of a lot of propensity score matching theory. So in particular, we have lots of administrative data in child welfare, and we can use it for this. We can use it to find matched subjects if we can find the outcomes we need in those data sets, and if we can find the matching variables that we need to determine whether they would have been selected into this study or not. So for instance there, if you design a study that is only, an intervention that only seeks to improve reunification in permanency, but doesn't address adoption or guardianship or relative placement, you might select on a case plan goal of reunification, for instance. So we need to know as specifically as we can what the selection criteria are. And that's true of an RCT as well. And then I'll take, if it can be done, I'll take models of the administrative data set that can predict two events of interest. One, the selection into the study, or selection for the intervention, more specifically. And then, if necessary, we may be able to predict the outcome event from baseline observations. So in the case of PI, we were predicting permanency in various time frames, and we called it stable permanency because we're looking for no reentry afterwards. So we needed a very specific outcome event with enough follow-up that we could do it. What I found was that in some of the sites, well, the range was, I think, from 90 to 96% accuracy, predicting whether the subject would be in a permanent home within 12 months from baseline. So that's pretty decent accuracy, and that was using 300 variables, right? But when I whittle it down to the 20 most important variables, we still are running around 92 to 95% accuracy. So just matching on what we ended up with 20 variables probably gives you a very good comparison group. Now, that's the plus part, is looking at the outcome. And for that, as I said, you have to be very careful not to bring in the future information. But traditional propensity score matching doesn't use that. It predicts only the selection into the study. And in our case, as I said, it would have failed. Okay, so we're matching on a set of baseline observed covariates that are predicting these two things, as I said. And we used a one-to-one match. Now, if you had a large enough pool and you wanted, and it might help your statistical power, depending on how you analyze things, you don't have to do one-to-one. You could do 2-to-1 or 5-to-1. But usually, I think we're looking at one-to-one match where the comparison subject has the same likelihood of selection and, in our case, the same likelihood of the outcome at baseline, at what we could observe at baseline. So we validated the method against some RCTs, so we were running a randomized trial, but at the same time, or using the same data set, I can look back in the administrative data, which there was plenty, and find matching subjects. And then what I'm seeking to do is produce all of the same statistical tests and effects as the control group. What I would expect is that the group, the matched group, would look like the folks in the study, the subjects in the study who did not receive the intervention. And then we would be able to evaluate the difference between them. So that was one. We were testing the method. I've also applied this to a county practice model formative evaluation where we did a system-wide event evaluation, and the RCT was precluded, as I said. And then also a statewide private versus public family finding formative evaluation. And there it was a broken randomization, and we were able to go back and pick up the same data set and do an evaluation and find that one of the, in this case, 3 different treatment options actually appeared to have a very big effect. And that drove some funding decisions as well. So in that statewide budget, that statewide evaluation, wait, I'm sorry, that's a repeat. And lastly, we used this to estimate the effect of Child Protective Services on a birth cohort, actually a 2-year birth cohort. So I'm still in process with that, but that's a statewide comparison of millions of child welfare intake records and millions of births. And what I'm finding is that many families had some pre-birth CPS contact, and if we can match them up to the non-CPS families that had no contact with the CPS system, then we may have a group that we can use for evaluating a wide range of outcomes. Of particular interest for us are child fatalities. So I'm simply matching on everything that would bring a family to the attention of the Child Protective Services agency at the birth, and then looking out from the birth 12 months and seeing how many fatalities we had in the 2 groups. Okay, so the first example, this was an evaluation of the method. And for this, I'm going to use what are called survival charts, but it's pretty simple to read. I've put a pointer here on the y-axis where the y-axis is showing the percentage of subjects that are exoning to a permanent family. And so at time 0, down here, we have none. That's at baseline. Now, remember, they're all at different baselines, but we can line them all up at time 0. This is all the subjects' baselines put together on this time 0. And then we look across. At 6 months, we're up to about 20% permanent, and by 12 months, we're up to about 45%. There are 3 groups here, and the black line is the treatment group. These are the children in the randomized trial that received the intervention. And you see the black line is above the other 2 lines, the blue and the red. So there was an intervention effect here, and it looks to be about 5 to 8% between the 2 groups. And then the red line is the control group from the randomized trial. So those are the children in the randomized trial that did not receive the intervention, and you see they're a lower level at 12 months. And the blue line is a matched group. And you see it deviates in a couple of places, but generally the blue line is pretty well coincident with the red line, which is what we want. So that's using the matching that I'm describing, purely from administrative data. Next is the evaluation that we did for PI, where we did not have a randomized trial, and so we did not have a control group. 100% of the subjects were treated, so we couldn't have a control group. We used historical data and some implementation data as well. And we had, like I said, about 300 variables considered, 5 sites, which was another problem. It would have been very expensive to randomize in all 5 sites, and things were not being rolled out on the same timeline, et cetera. Very complicated. All the outcomes differed. What we found was that the black line, again, is the treatment group. At 12 months, they were, I think it was about 8% more higher permanency. And then as we went over time, of course, you can see that the 2 lines crossed. So up here at 24 months, the matched group catches back up, and then the matched group exceeds. But the outcome of interest was at 12 months. But this other effect is important, and we will take that into account. So there might be short-term effects to it. But it did improve the timeliness of the permanency, it appears.
Andy, we've got a question.
Yeah. Oh, I see, over here. Confused by matching on likelihood of outcome. Yeah. Okay, so the question is, if we match on the outcome, the likelihood of the outcome, aren't we washing out the potential group differences in the outcome, the primary research question? You could call it washing out, but I don't think it's washing out. I think we're matching on the characteristics of the subjects at the baseline that predict their outcome. And so if we're looking for the effect of our intervention purely, then the subjects in the comparison group did not have the intervention, then the differences that we see, if we see any, should be due to that intervention. So I think that's the, I don't know if that gets it across, but we want to know, if we can, everything about what drives the outcomes at baseline, because we want to match for that very specifically. That way we isolate our intervention's effect. Yeah, okay. So matching, not the outcome itself, right. You cannot use any of the future information, don't use the outcome itself, but only factors that influence the outcome, correct. So I think if we do that, we have an additional set of factors, in addition to traditional propensity score matching, that we can use for matching. And the outcome and this varied by sites as well, because different sites had different selection criteria. So the outcomes the matching on outcome factors was more important in some sites than in others. And of course, if you can't predict the outcome very well, it's not going to be a very useful match either. But in this case, we could predict the outcome often better than we could predict selection into the study. Okay, back to, this is an example. Here, on my survival chart, I wanted to show you this green line. The green line here are the unmatched subjects. So that kind of gets to this point about the selection bias and the difference between the group that we're bringing into our intervention and the general population of children in child welfare. The green line is the curve of the permanency over time for children who were not selected into the study and were not in the comparison group. They do much, much better because we're trying to select the children here who are going to have the most difficult time getting to a timely permanency. And we're doing a very good job of that. So the black line is the treatment group. These are children who got this family-finding intervention. And you see that they're not performing so well up until 12 months. They're actually lower than the comparison groups that they were matched to. So business as usual in the agency is actually doing better at 6 months. Now, this made sense, actually, in this intervention because there was about a 6-month startup time that they went through where they were transitioning the case, getting up to speed, finding relatives. They needed some time to do these things. That's what this 6-month period is. The Child Welfare Agency in the blue, they had a running start. So they already were looking for relatives. They had an idea of what permanency options they had. So they were doing a better job up until 6 months. But then at 12, we equalize, and then by 18, and just after 18 months, the permanency really takes off for the treatment group. Now the numbers, notice here, these are the ends. We started out with 87 subjects, and they're matched with 87 subjects. The numbers are very small here. So that effect, and the overall effect, though it might be statistically insignificant because, depending on which test you use, but we can clearly see that something is happening around 18 months for a good percentage of these subjects, to where we jump from about 30% to about, about 15% up to about 35%. And then I have one more example. Oh, no, I don't have that one. Sorry. I can't show you that one. So those are the things we've tested this on. We'd like to find some more randomized trials to test this with, and we will. So it's pretty easy to add on. Now, the pitfalls of using this method. One I don't have on here is it's pretty complicated, and it can be pretty complicated to interpret the results because we have to have a lot of faith in the matching here. As we do in randomized trials, we have a lot of faith in the randomization, and so we can draw strong inferences from that. Here, I think, we should have a lot less faith. So everything needs to be taken with a very large grain of salt. So results are not causative, as I said. So that's one of the big pitfalls. But here are some really specific pitfalls that we ran into in these studies. Call it leakage, future information coming back into the baseline observations, and there are various ways to detect that. Most important is to use a validation sample and always hold out and check everything. Structural bias, as I said, that data quality example, and that came up more than once, where data quality issues, for instance, going back and amending records years later would change, that would then be a difference between comparison and intervention subjects. The matching variable selection, this is, I can't overemphasize this. When you get up to 20 variables and you're trying to match every child and every one of those variables and find every unusual arrangement you can think of, it gets very, very difficult. So I'm working on methods for doing this matching better, but there's a lot of work to do there. In general, from my experience, you need about 5 times as many children in your matching pool, as the children you can select comparisons from, as you have in your intervention. So it takes a lot of data. The weighting, when you're matching, because you can't match perfectly on things like, age to the day or number of days that the child has been in care at baseline, you necessarily have to match within intervals. So I would use usually deciles, but even with that, you can't get perfect matches, and so you have to weight your variables. And you want to weight them by the strength of the model. Oh, I'm sorry. I see a question now. I'm going to go. Let me get through this slide, and I'll go back, and I'll explain that green line again. Blending the two models, and the match precision is, as I said, I use deciles a lot, age categories. You want to be as precise as you can, but some variables are not as important to match, so you can relax on those. And it's difficult to come up with the metrics that we need for that. And lastly, the equivalence. Matching can drive imbalances. So in a randomized controlled trials, many times you'll take a set of demographics, characteristics, and if your randomization is working, you'll see that the demographics of the control and the treatment groups match up very nicely. And that's often a very good check on your randomization, whether it worked or not. In this, because we're balancing amongst a finite matching pool to a set of variables very strongly, we're pulling, in effect, pulling the demographics away from those things we didn't match on. So we'll often have imbalances in the demographics. And what we have to rely on is that those are not important to the outcome that we're interested in. Now I'm going to go back and explain this survival chart one more time. The green line here is that's the outcome for the pool of children who were not matched into the study. So there were selection criteria for this intervention, and those selection criteria were over 24 months in care, but a lot of other things that we think are strongly related to long stays in foster care. The green group, that's made up of children that came into care recently, had a reunification plan, all the things that we know can drive a quick permanency. So the point here is to show that they were filtered out, that if you include those children in that green line in your comparison group, your intervention's not going to look very good. So it's important that we take those out, and that's how big the effect is. And yes, there is a large difference in the sample size in the unmatched group, of course, because that was huge. But the matched and the treatment group have exactly the same sample size. Unless there are other questions, I'm going to get to the takeaways here. Informative, or when randomized designs aren't feasible or they fail, and you want an insurance policy against a failed randomization, I think it's a really good idea to make sure you acquire those maybe 3 or 4 dates that you need and identifiers to link into administrative data sets as a backup, just in case. And I would do it in any case, because if you do the matching as well as the randomization, it just gives you another, I think it'll give you a lot better feeling about your randomization, because if your control group lines up with your matched group, everything probably went well. But if there are big differences there, and you can maybe point a finger at certain factors that influence the differences between a matched and a control group, you might be able to pick up problems with your study. So I think it's a very good insurance policy. And I'm looking at questions again. Does the unmatched group include all records? No. So if there are strong selection criteria, that we can filter out on, then we won't include them into the matching pool, those subjects. So subjects that we would never match on. I'll go back to my slide there. I think in my, one of the selection criteria in this one was children had to be in care over 24 months. All the children in that green line unmatched group were in care over 24 months. But many of them had planned goals of reunification. Many of them were younger than the matched group. There were many, many characteristics that were different. Down at the bottom in this very fine print are the characteristics that were matched on. So the most important characteristic was their baseline length of stay. Second was the number of days that they had stayed in their current setting at baseline. Third was a prediction from the machine learning models of their, in this case, selection into the study, and then the outcome. Placement settings, that's placement stability. Number of children in the removal group, goal of guardianship, a lot of characteristics. Sex, follow-up time, all of these were matched on. So these are the 20 characteristics. And they're different in every site, the characteristics. So it isn't a one-size-fits-all that you can just take away a set of 4 or 5 factors that you need to match on. Sites are very different. In many sites, the 4E eligibility was a very strong determinant of their future permanency outcomes, for instance.
Andy, there's another question.
Yeah, I'm looking over at the
not sure if you see this one. Can you talk at some point about how you narrowed the 300 variables down to 20?
Yes, okay. So for that, I had 2 models, one for selection into the study and one for the outcome, using the baseline variables, 300 at baseline. And I put the 300 variables into each of those models in a machine learning model, and I used all the variables. And then it churns away on it for a while, and it comes out with predictions. And with those predictions, in this case, I used a random forest model using the extreme gradient boosting algorithm. And it can assign importance, they call it importance, to each of the variables. It's effectively how much of the error the variable accounts for, or how much of the variability in the data accounts for, and how often it was used in the decision trees in the random forest. That's a lot more detail than you need probably, but the algorithm can assign importances to each of the variables. So I took the 20 most important. That's the short answer. And I figured out that I could feasibly match 20 variables within the matching pool that I had, which had about 5 to 1, as I said. So if you have a larger pool, you can use more variables. But with small pools, and you're going to be limited, matching on less than 20 variables really changed things a lot. So I think it's important to have as many as you can feasibly use. Because when you think about all the interactions that lead to outcomes and the success or failure of an intervention, you want to get as much of that in there as you can. Any other questions I missed, Heidi?
Nope, none that I have on this end.
Okay. So those are my takeaways. You can, whenever you can, I think, use the vanilla propensity score matching, but even when you're using that, I think that this using machine learning models to do the variable selection worked really well for me. and you know, anytime you're doing model selection, I think something like a random forest algorithm where it takes a big picture look at the entire data set and takes some sort of objective, as objectives that we can get, measure of variable importance, will lead you to much more efficient models. And then if you need a linear model, for instance, you can take the variables from that and put them in. The machine learning algorithms can tell you a lot about interactions and about relationships between variables that are nonlinear, and you can use a lot of that in linear modeling as well to do explanations. So it works for a lot of different applications. Any other questions, or?
Nope, that looks like it. We'll give just another second again, and if anyone has a question, you can type it into that chat box. If you direct it to presenter, it'll get to us most quickly. And yes, there will be a recording of the presentation on the James Bell Associates website. We'll get that up probably within the next 24 to 48 hours. And we can also make a PDF of the slides available to anyone who needs it. You can just reach out to us. I'm not seeing any other questions coming in.
Good, because I'm very hoarse.
Oh,
I can't talk for an hour straight.
Oh, here's a question. So here, PSM is a step before any other modeling in IT?
Yes, correct. Yes, so yeah, that wasn't in this presentation, but we did some further modeling after this using the comparison group and the treatment group that we had, and that was the explanatory modeling, and you know, the variables that we found from the matching were very useful for that as well. So there is a lot more modeling that you can do beyond this, particularly if your numbers are large. In our PI project, the numbers, I'll run back to that one. Numbers were pretty, I cut the numbers out, yeah, so you couldn't identify things. But the numbers were on the order of 2,000 in each group. So we did have a lot of explanatory modeling that we could do.
All right, I don't see any other questions. Oh, there is one more.
Yeah, I see that. Can this method account for cases that were open to a system in the pre-intervention historical context? Yes. So if I'm interpreting the question correctly, maybe this is an example. There were, this one doesn't have it. Well, okay, let me give you the short answer then. Yes, I think, so I brought in linked Child Protective Services record in these studies. So we were looking at long-term foster care for this, but we had, in the modeling, we took into account allegations, sizes of sibling groups, various factors, age of the child at report from previous CPS episodes as well. So if any of that influences the outcome or selection into the study, then yes, it would be matched into the model, and it certainly could. this particular model had as its third strongest matching factor the time since review by a court, for instance. So and I think it worked that if the case was reviewed within a couple of weeks prior to the baseline, it was, as you might expect, more likely to go to permanency. So we could look at things like that as well.
Well, thank you, Andy, very much. So again, we're going to put a recorded version of the webinar up on the JBA website, and I can send the PDF of the slides to you if you're interested in having that. I want to again extend our gratitude to Andy, and thank you to all of you who took out the time to join us. We really appreciate you being here, particularly for the more technical presentations. So I wish you all a good afternoon. Take care. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Heidi. And thank you all for your good questions. Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all. Bye, y'all.